Hey UX community. We've been talking about auto layout quite a lot through these first few videos. And I want to jump in and do a little bit more of an intermediate introduction to auto layout here and now, because we want to probably try to construct every page with a complete auto layout rather than getting too far down the path and then coming back and doing that. So I think now's a good time to go ahead and introduce you to more of what auto layout can do. We did a slight introduction to that in terms of how it worked for making our buttons responsive and that kind of thing, and you've heard me talk about it for a little while now, so let's just jump on in and do that. I know at one point I had mentioned that I could have used it to construct this grid a little bit quicker than the way that I did it using these shapes, but at the time I didn't want to get into that. And then anytime I'm doing something in here on these videos, I like to make sure that I'm explaining to you guys what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And so I didn't feel like that was the time to really start to dig into auto layout right out of the gate. But let's get into that a little bit more now. So for example, if we wanted to go back and let's say we're going to revisit this grid page, let's lay out this grid page using an auto layout instead. And so what that means is I don't really, the more advanced I've gotten with auto layout and the more that I start to use that in my day-to-day and the more I start to like build out mock-ups and prototypes and things with it, the less and less I'm actually using shapes. I don't use shapes too frequently anymore unless there's a specific shape that I'm looking for that I can't get out of a frame. Frames just give you a lot more flexibility in terms of what you can do with them. The auto layout features that they can contain, just make them super powerful. And so I don't really use shapes anymore unless I really need to for something. So let's jump in and let's go ahead. Let's just create a new grid page. And so we can leave this one intact while we're working. So let's go ahead and just create another grid page. We'll just create a duplicate of that, and we'll just delete everything off of it. Whoops. Let's delete everything off of it except the page. We don't want to delete the page. So I think that should do it. And now we've got a nice fresh page to start with. Now, one of the things that I would probably do to start with is I would just take literally this whole page and I would just make this an auto layout right away, right out of the gate. So I would just hit Shift A and that will make this an auto layout. Now, we're probably going to, we'll probably want some types of settings in here, but we'll want these settings to match what we want out of our grid. Not these sort of default settings that Figma gives you when you make something in auto layout. So let's start with our columns because it's pretty common to use a 12-column grid. So let's assume we're starting with the column structure, and so we'll change this direction of this auto layout from vertical to horizontal. And then we know that when we did the spacing in here that we were adhering to our 8-point grid. So I believe I did the spacing at 24 if I recall. So we'll make that 24. And then I think on either side we were, I believe, at 72. We can adjust that later if need be. And then on the top and bottom here, if we wanted to achieve this same type of an effect, like let's say we wanted the 8-point grid to start below our header and we were trying to create this header spacing, now we'd have to do that a little bit differently here. So if we wanted to create this header spacing and have no spacing down here at the bottom, then that's not really important right now because we're actually doing we're doing the columns rather than the rows right now, so we don't need to worry about that right now. But what we would want to do when we get to that, and I'll talk about it there, is we'd want to separate these values so we could set a different value at the top than we'd want to set at the bottom. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but for the time being, let's set these to 0 because we're focused on the columns right now. So now what I was talking about in terms of shapes is I built this quickly with shapes just because, again, I didn't want to get too too far into the weeds on that first tutorial as to why I was using a frame to create shapes. But now let's do it the way I would actually do it. And the way I would actually do it is I would set this inside of here. Actually, here let's undo. Let's go back to our main auto layout real quick, and I just want to change something. So right now this auto layout is defaulted to hug content, so that's why it started to change when I put something inside of it. So what we want to do right now is we want this outer grid to stay at the size that it's at. So let's just set that to fixed width and fixed height, and that will keep it so that it doesn't resize when we put something inside of it. So now we'll draw out another frame inside of it. So this particular frame, you can see what it did is it left that, we put padding of 72 on either side, so you can see it's automatically indenting this for us. And then I can't remember exactly what the width of these was. Let's double check that. They were 56, so in here we might want to set these to 56. And then what we can do, because this is an auto layout, is I can now say, okay, I want to make this fill container. And so because we set a fixed width out here, that will fill the rest of this container that it sits inside of. And so now that will stretch it automatically to the bottom for us. So I don't remember exactly what color we used here. Let's assume that I probably used the blue, it looks like, at some opacity. So let's go in here and in our fill here, let's select from our primary colors. Let's select that blue. And then I don't remember what I set that opacity to. It looks pretty light. Maybe it's like a 6 or something. So let's go ahead and do that. That looks about right. So now here's the power of auto layout, is we've already set the padding on either side of this. We know we need 12 of these columns. We know we want them to be spaced evenly. We already set all of that stuff out here. We said space anything that's in here at 24, leave 72 padding. So now all we got to do is go in here and just hit duplicate. So you can just dupe, dupe, dupe. It's automatically going to set all of this for us. And we didn't have to do anything else. All we had to do is hit the duplicate key a bunch of times. And so now we've got our 12 column grid structure here, and that's already built out. So now where it gets a little bit trickier is on this 8.1, we want to do an 8 point. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to lay it in here, because if we try to lay it in here, it's going to get placed over here on the end, and it's going to start really wrecking things. So it's tricky, because now what we're going to have to do is, in order to create the other one, is we're going to have to create another auto layout that lays exactly over the top of this one. So the way that I would handle that probably is I would say, okay, let's say this is our grid page. We'll go ahead and leave this as is. Now there's a couple of different ways we could do this, but I'm going to show you sort of the most common for right now, which is that we would probably just want to basically duplicate this and not have it set inside of itself any longer. We'd probably just want to have it set. So let's duplicate this. Whoops, sorry, I didn't want to duplicate the whole outer frame. Well, I did, but let's do it this way. Here, we'll do it this way. We'll keep it all inside of this main grid, but what we're going to do is we're going to do something a little bit different. Let's go ahead and create another frame inside of this main grid, and it's going to break things for a minute. It's going to mess things up for a minute. But now that we have another frame drawn in here, another auto layout frame, let's take that frame and let's make it an auto layout. So hit Shift A again. That will make this frame an auto layout. Now we know that our height and width settings are 1080 here, so we'll say fixed width, fixed height. We'll set that to 1080. We'll set the height to 1080. Now that's going to really break things for just a second here, but what we want to do now is we want to go up here and we want to say absolute positioning. And so once you click absolute positioning, if you've written any HTML or whatever, this will be familiar to you. So now we can absolute position this inside of the grid frame, and it will absolute position itself without disrupting the auto layout that it's inside of. We might be getting a little bit more advanced than I planned here, but you know, just go with it. We'll get through this together. So now we've got this sort of, you know, this absolute position frame in here, which, you know, it can really sit anywhere. It can sit anywhere at once now that it's an absolute position frame, but we're going to move it up to the top. And the reason that we're doing that is because it will make it a little bit easier to access, so we're not trying to accidentally dropping things into these other frames that we used to construct those columns. So let's go ahead and copy one of those frames, though. Let's for the sake of just ease of use, we can just kind of copy one of those. And then if you select this absolute position frame, let's go ahead and just name this. Actually, let's not name it absolute. Let's name it rows. So, and then select rows and paste into it the frame that we just had. So now what we'll do is let's take a look at the absolute position values of that. So the values of that absolute position frame are the default ones that Figma gives you. So let's just go ahead and zero those out real quick. Now let's select that interior frame, and for the rows, I believe I made those the green, and again just did a really light value on that. So let's go over here to our colors again, and let's select our secondary green color. And then in this particular instance, we're going to want probably to say fill container on the width. So select fill container, we'll see that green goes all the way across, and then we'll set a fixed height here. So let's set that fixed height to 8, because that is our 8 pix grid. So we're gonna want 8 pixels there to tell us where one row of our 8 pix grid lives. So now that we have that selected, we can go back up here to this top, to its parent frame again. Let's go back up to rows again real quick, and let's say, okay, let's switch the direction of this. We don't want this one to go horizontal, we want this one to go vertical. And we're going to want the spacing here to be 8 point again. So we want to say 8 on the spacing there. So now if we go inside of it and select the interior row frame, now we can do duplicate again. So you can just duplicate this. When you duplicate it, you'll see that it spaces them out 8 pix, and each row is 8 pix. So we effectively get our 8 pix striping here for our row grid. And then now, like I was telling you before, what we want to do is we want to go up here again, make sure that over here in your grid construction, make sure you're on this rows again. And again, like I was talking about here, if we wanted to set this top area, like let's say we wanted to have some space here before our grid begins, we could do that with padding. So we could just go over here and separate those two values, because we do not want that padding at the bottom. We only want that padding at the top. So let's separate all these values by clicking this little icon here. This separates your values into individual values. And then I believe I set that top to like 72, I believe was what we had. So let's set that to 72 on the top only, and that should space things out appropriately. And that looks pretty close. Now all of these frames that we have inside that are creating our rows, those might be a little dark still, or a little bit too pronounced rather. So let's change that to 4.4% on the opacity to lighten those up just a tad. And then if we go into that frame and select the bottom one here, we can just duplicate that all the way down now. And now if we just hold duplicate, just hold your command key and your D key until you get down here to the bottom. And then that looks like there's exactly 8 pix left, and there is. So that is how we've constructed our grid now using auto layout. And we have a complete auto layout page now, which is great. You know, that'll give us a lot of flexibility. Now here on constructing this grid, you know, that's not as valuable, sort of. I mean, it is valuable, and here's why it's valuable. I'll tell you guys why. Because I wanted to do this not so much because it's important. This is actually going to get quite complex if you start trying to put documentation in here and stuff like that. You're going to have a bunch of absolute frames, and it's going to get tricky. So we're not going to get too deep into writing up the grid documentation in here or whatever for right now. But the reason I wanted you guys to see this is because I use this kind of a trick for doing all kinds of things, for creating patterns, for creating icons. You need a hamburger menu. You can actually just throw it inside of a frame and, draw your little top line of your hamburger menu and then duplicate that a couple more times and you got a hamburger menu or whatever. There's all kinds of creative ways to use this sort of, this sort of a notion in your designs or whatever. So let's go ahead and delete that original grid that I constructed. I mean, what you could do also is we could also then just do another absolute frame over the top of this, or and we could start constructing another auto layout inside of that for putting our write-up or our text values if you wanted to sort of define this grid for your audience or whatever, if you wanted to do some write-up around that. And what we could also do is we could go in and we could say, okay, let's lock all this interior elements down. We could also put these columns inside of a columns frame that lives inside of the grid. There's lots of different ways you can figure out how to use auto layout. The more you use it, the more you'll figure out your own techniques for how to make it work, and like where you should be embedding them and where you should not be, and that kind of thing. For the time being, let's just call that done on the grid page. It looks like our grid. It's an exact replica of our grid for the most part. If we turn our grid on, you can see everything sort of gets more pronounced because you can see the actual grid laying over the top of it. So we were spot on in terms of all of our math. So we're all good there. We can turn the grid back off. So now the other thing we can do is let's say we want to turn our grid back on. Let's move over to colors and let's go ahead and create an auto layout page here. So we'll turn this into an auto layout, and again we want to go, it's defaulting to hug content, so let's just go set fix. Let's turn it back to 1080 by 1080 or whatever your size is. So now we have our auto layout here, and we're going to want to change some of these values. So we'll want to leave that 72 on there because this is the outer frame. So we'll want our page padding or whatever there for the outer frame probably. Auto layout, you can turn that however you want. You can see that we've got some auto layout alignment here, some alignment options. So you can choose to center things. You can choose to align things however you want. The more that you use this, the more this will, the more you'll start to figure out like how you want to do this. You can also do some other interesting things. Like let's say we wanted all of these colors to align. Let's say we wanted these colors to align horizontally. And then let's say we wanted all of these elements to use up all of the space that was available between our two padded spaces. You could go over here, and if you click this little ellipse, there's some options in here, and you can select things. You can see that you can do things as packed like we have them now, or you can do a space between. And when you do space between, you'll see that these will use all the available space and it will space them equally in between. So that's a pretty handy trick, when you start getting into more complex auto layouts as well, like knowing when to switch back and forth between packed versus space between. You can also change different things like strokes excluded or included in layout, so you can add strokes or whatever, or exclude strokes. You can also change this last on top and first on top, and right now we're not going to see anything happen here because our color dots are not sitting close enough to each other. But let's say on this colors frame that we chose a negative spacing, we'll start to see those things start to overlap. And so now, as you're seeing those things starting to overlap, with this negative spacing, like let's say we had a negative 24 here or these things, and we went, oh, well, we don't want the white to be on top. We want the purple to be on top. So you could go in here in this canvas stacking order. This is a fantastic feature that was introduced not that long ago. Like they didn't used to have this. You used to have to do all kinds of trickery to get this kind of thing to work. But now we've got negative spacing, and we can say first on top. We'll just switch the order. So that's another thing that will get really handy over time. Like the more advanced we get here, the more you'll start to see the value, and being able to switch this stacking order is super, super handy. So let's just go ahead, and it doesn't really matter. We can leave that a default because we're going to undo that anyway. Let's say we wanted to do 24 on the spacing, where those would align specifically to the columns in our grid. And we did these at the exact size of the column, so that's going to be a perfect spacing. And let's say that for this particular case, let's say we want to align these to the top. And then, you know, if we wanted to put this top sort of spacing that we have for our header there, I think we said that was 72 at the top. But if we wanted to put some other sort of default padding there or something like that, we could either do that. I wouldn't do that in this main frame up here. What I would do is I would put these inside of another auto layout so that I had some additional control inside of that. So if I wanted to, I would just select all of these and I would say auto layout again. And now they're in their own auto layout. And you can see what's pretty cool is when we put them in the auto layout, Figma remembered the padding that we had around them, and it moved that into their auto layout frame for us, so we don't have to go mucking around with the settings again. It already remembered the way that we had things set. Now what we could do is we could put some additional padding on the top. Like let's say we said, okay, we've got this 72 for our header bar, but let's say we want to make sure that these first elements are always 40 pixels from that header or whatever. Now we're only doing math around what we want the white space to be. So we could do this over and over and over again. You can do all kinds of embedding to get any kind of layout that you need. So let's go ahead and let's select this main thing, and then let's say for example we wanted this to go fill container, just to make sure that it's filling up the whole row. We could also, let's say if we wanted to start to lay these out like before, I think we had them laid out so that we had, you know, like primary colors together and a secondary color, and we had some different things kind of aligned a bit differently. So let's go in here and let's just drag these things around. Let's get all of the whites to darks next to each other. We've got I think we had the purple and the blue as our primary colors, and then we had the green as a secondary, and then we had these guys as our neutrals. So if we wanted to do all that again, what we could do is we could just say, okay, we're gonna this main frame, you want to make sure that you're up here on the parent frame, and we could duplicate that. Okay, the stacking order for our auto layout inside of our parent element is horizontal, and we probably actually want that to be vertical, so we could go ahead and dupe these. If you wanted the spacing to be different between them, then you could just take that out here. We could just set that back to 0 or whatever we wanted that to be. So we've already got the 24 set out on the parent, so it will space those by 24 as long as we do it that way. Let's go ahead and dupe that one more time, and now we could just go in here and say, okay, we're gonna, this is gonna be our primaries in this first row. Maybe this one's gonna be our secondary colors in this particular case. I know we only have one. This seems kind of silly, but in a real scenario, you'd probably have a bunch of different ones. So now we have all of this built out in an auto layout. And the reason why this is so valuable, it's not going to seem that valuable to us right now as we're talking through this stuff, but why this is so valuable is because when you get your design system really built out and it's super robust, and you start to get a lot, once it's really mature and you've got a whole bunch of stuff in here, now if I want to come in at some point and I go, okay, I'm going to add a couple more primary colors into this. Now I just do it, and I just set my colors here, and my new primary colors are in. and it didn't take a bunch of work. I didn't have to go in there and physically drag stuff around and try to make sure their spacing's good and all of that. Like anything that I change, it already knows what I want the spacing to be for that area. So it's super, super powerful, and we're going to get into some really advanced versions of this auto layout stuff. Like we're going to get in and build, you know, some responsive tables and things of that nature. We're going to get into this like really heavily at some point, but you know, for the sake of just kind of teaching you guys a little bit more about auto layout and what you can do with it. You know, we didn't get to see that much about what it could do when we were building these buttons. I mean, yeah, we got to see that it adds some padding and it can allow things to flex and stuff, and it was neat. But where it really starts to get it, you know, where it really starts to show its power is when you start using it in full layouts and start using it in your mock-ups, and you start seeing like, oh man, when I need to go in here and edit something, look how easy this is now. You know, we all know how frequently we've got to go in and edit mock-ups or prototypes or whatever, or somebody comes along and adds a bunch of more copy or whatever, and if you've got all that thought out and built out and the way that you want those new items to flow in, then it just makes editing things so much easier as you go. So again, let's go ahead and do, you know, let's go ahead and do all of this stuff. Let's do it everywhere. Let's go ahead and throw it all in and just kind of get through all of these pages. And then as we move forward from this point forward, you know, when we create new pages or create new elements or whatever, we'll make sure that we do everything in auto layout from this point forward. So again, let's go ahead and create our auto layout here. We'll make the outer parent component, that 1080 by 1080. Let's go ahead and do it with buttons. Let's make that an auto layout. Again, that's Shift A. Definitely learn that shortcut key. That one will be valuable to you. So again, we've got to set this to fixed on both axes, and we've got to set it to 1080 by 1080. All right, and then in here, we might want to go in here, and again, let's just go ahead and let's use the power of Figma here. Like Figma is very good about doing stuff with batches, so let's go in here and just make sure we've got all these settings set right. We want this to be vertical. Yep, that's good. We want the padding to be 72 on either side, and then in terms of this sort of padding here, what it did is when we put that auto layout, Figma saw that we had spacing there. We had those set at 104, and so it just kept that for us. We're going to go ahead and zero that out for the time being. Actually, we do want to separate those values and then put that 72 at the top like we did before. So now we can go in and select these elements. Let's just go in and select our H1s. Let's just select all of these font styles that we had. Let's go ahead and throw those into an auto layout. So now we'll get into something else here real quick. Let's go ahead and let's set this value to fill container, just so that we're kind of filling up that space and we're telling it how to behave. And then let's say that, remember how we had these laid out before, right? We had these kind of set in groups a little bit. So now what we've done is we've put all these values in here into this singular auto layout, and this gives us the ability to set that top padding. Like I think we said that we wanted that top padding to be 4, so let's separate these values. Let's make the top padding 40. Let's do the same thing here. Let's get in here and just select. Let's select all of these elements. So what we can do, here's another trick. So I want to select all of the elements inside of here. So I'm going to select the parent, and then if you just hit enter, it will go one level deeper on your selection. So you can see now that it's got everything inside of that parent element selected for me. If you want to go back up the tree, you just hit Shift Enter and you'll go back up the tree. This is another trick that you're definitely going to want to commit to memory. The further that we go and the more advanced that we get in this stuff, the more valuable that's going to become to you when you start really doing a lot of batch edits. that's huge. So again, we've got the parent component selected. I want everything inside of it, so I hit enter. I've got everything selected now. Let's hit Shift A. That puts us into an auto layout. Again, let's set the width of that to fill container. Let's separate these values over here in the auto layout. Let's set that top spacing to 40 so that we've got the same top spacing for everything across the board. And then again, once we get inside here, you know, I think we had, like if I recall, I think we had these elements stacked next to each other. So if you wanted to do that, you could select both of those items and just hit Shift A again to put them in an auto layout. And then let's switch the direction over here in the auto layout from horizontal to, or from vertical to horizontal rather. And then again, we could put a spacing in here. So if we wanted to adhere to our 8-pix grid or whatever, let's say we wanted to maintain that spacing, we'd just say 24 to make sure everything's got sort of that same sort of gap in between them when we do those things. Now let's do that for these other buttons as well. We'll select them. Again, Shift A for auto layout, change it to horizontal, change the spacing to 24. Let's do that again for this auto layout, direction, spacing. So now if you wanted to start to create groupings here, again, we could just embed more auto layout. So let's say we had some kind of write up here, you know, default button state. We just have sort of a title, if you will. So let's select both of those items and we'll create, if we select both of these guys, actually here, let's select both of those. We'll do another auto layout around those. We'll select both of these, another auto layout. Both of these bottom ones, another auto layout. So now we have an auto layout down here at the very bottom that's horizontal to space the buttons. We have another parent auto layout. If we go up one level, remember Shift Enter goes up a level. Now that aligns these things vertically. Now if we wanted to space these elements out from one another, we could select all of them. We could wrap them in another auto layout. So Shift A again, make sure that auto layout's vertical. And then if we wanted to do the same type of spacing, we could do 24 again. Or whatever we wanted that to be, 32, 24, whatever. Whatever you want that spacing to be for your white space in there. And then you can see that now we've got that ability. And then you might want to go in here and say fill container on the parent object again, just to make sure it fills that space. You don't have to. You could adjust that stuff later if you find out that you need to adjust it in that direction for some reason. If we start to add additional button styles or something, we might want those to go across or you know, that type of thing. So now let's come back over here to the font, and the font styles is the other area I was going to show you that little trick with too, is that you might want to have these like grouped together. So you might want to select all of your H1s and put those in an auto layout. Now we could change the spacing there. Like we might want these to be tighter because they're a group. So we might want those only to be spaced by 16 or something of that nature, maybe. So if we selected all of our H2s, put them in an auto layout, select all of our bodies, put them in an auto layout. Now again, you can select all of those auto layout groups, put those in another auto layout, because now we could go in here and we could say, yeah, that's too much. I want to make that 8 point, the spacing. I want to make the spacing on these 8 point. Make the spacing on these 8 point. But now I might want to space these groups out and have a bigger gap between the groups. So now I could go in and I could, now I've got all of those elements. Again, I could just hit Shift Enter, will take me up the tree one. So now I'm up at the parent level, and now we've got 24 spacing there, but maybe we want that to be 32, or maybe you want it to be 40, whatever you want it to be. Like you can start to set all of your padding, all of your padding and spacing rules, and how we're kind of setting up these groupings and stuff can all have separate controls. It's just a matter of embedding them into one another in all the correct ways. So again, you'll start to get more and more used to this. And again, where this gets so powerful is now let's say, okay, we've only got our H1 and H2 in here. Let's say we want to add an H3. Now we can just go into that grouping. We can duplicate that grouping. And now we could just go in and change the type here to H3, and we could set up a new, we could set up a new style for whatever that H3 is going to be. Or we could remove one and everything adjusts. So it's so powerful because it starts to give you real flexibility in your mock-ups and or prototypes. So I think this one probably has been going on a little bit longer than I was trying to keep all these around 30 minutes. It looks like we might be a little over the 30-minute block, so we'll probably go ahead and shut this down here for now. But again, the reason this is so powerful is because it gives you so much flexibility, and it keeps everything aligned to your grid at all times once you've really thought through how you're laying things out. So again, if we went in here, let's say we went in here and we went, okay, we want this title to have a little more spacing. That's too tight now. Let's go ahead and add an 8-point step in there. So I could select multiples, right? I could select these two auto layout groups together. I could have done that change to all of them at once. I could go in here, you see it's mixed now because we set 1 to 8 and the others aren't set to 8. So we could go in there and select that mix value and set them all to 8. And now it'll space them all equally because they're inside of those auto layouts. We couldn't do that without them being wrapped in all these auto layout frames. So it's just super, super powerful. I cannot really express enough to you guys like how important it is to start to really get comfortable with auto layout. It'll change the way that you do things. It will definitely change your world when you have to start making edits. When you've got some crazy mock-up built out, it's going to take a little more time up front to lay it all out correctly. But when you do, the editing process becomes not the nightmare that it used to be. So I can't recommend getting comfortable with auto layout enough. So I'm glad that we finally got in here and got to cover this a little bit more. Again, we'll get really, really advanced with this stuff when we start to get into one of the components. I want to get into more intermediate components with you guys, and I want to start to show you what kinds of crazy fun things you can do with components for your team, the way you can build those out. And when we get into more advanced components, I definitely want to show you how to build flexible tables with auto layout. That's a tricky one, but I've built some really crazy tables lately with auto layout that are very flexible for the team. And there's kind of some interesting tricks that I want to share with you guys there as well. So anyway, thanks for hanging in there with me for a few extra minutes on this one. Hopefully you see the value in this, and hopefully it feels valuable to you to sit through these. So I'll figure out what we're going to do on the next one, and yeah, you guys have a good one. Thanks for sitting through it with me, and we'll just see you on the next one. I'll start thinking about what the next one's going to look like. So thanks again. Cheers.